Welcome everyone. My name is Francesca Emanuele. I am Senior International Policy Associate at the Center for Economic and Policy Research. My work focuses on US policy toward Latin America and the Caribbean. And as you can imagine, my feeling is that we are going through a very frightening moment with 4,500 troops, US troops deployed in the Caribbean, with 3 boats that were obliterated by US strikes in the past 3 weeks, and 17 civilians that were extrajudicially executed by these US strikes. And everything under the pretext of US fighting narco-terrorism situation in our region. When everyone who has eyes, everyone who follows a little bit what's going on, knows that all of this operation, all of this militarization is trying to reassert US hegemony in the region, is trying to increase domination, intervention, military intervention, economic intervention, and also, I hope not, regime change. So, still this book, tracing the history of US-Latin American relations since the conquest, since the invasion of the European powers, offers us a needed sense of optimism. It reminds us that Latin America and the United States come from different traditions. One focused in individualism and expansionism, and another one focused in collectivism and solidarity and humanism. And even in periods of profound asymmetry, Latin Americans managed to advance principles of sovereignty and non-intervention, often within organizations such as the predecessors of the Organization of American States, that were themselves deeply dominated by the United States. So these principles not only shape international law, but in time even shape US policy itself. And Grandin shows us in 700 pages or more in the paper, much more. How many?
736, that's with the index.
Oh, okay. Shows us that Latin America has never been merely an object of domination. It has been a source of enduring ideas and struggles that continue to challenge and redefine the international order. Those principles, grounded in solidarity among states and codified in treaties, remain our tools today. And those spaces of diplomacy, even those spaces that are dominated by the US, even the Organization of American States, that is the topic of my PhD. Those spaces that seem fragile now remain essential in moments like the one we are living through. No negotiating space should be discarded, because negotiation and diplomacy, interaction, as we're doing today, are the only path for confronting violence and preventing war. And now I'm gonna go through the amazing bios of Greg Grandin and Ryan Grimm. So Greg Grandin is the Peter V. C. Van Woodward Professor of History at Yale University, where he also earned his doctorate. He's the author of several books, including Forlandia and the End of the Myth, which won the Pulitzer Prize, and The Blood of Guatemala, winner of the Bryce Wood Award. A member of the American Academy of Arts and Sciences, Grandin writes widely for outlets like The Nation and The New York Times, and is a regular guest on Democracy Now! Actually, you were there like 2 weeks ago. Yeah. Ryan Grimm is the co-founder of Drogside News and a longtime DC reporter who has broken news from the halls of Congress while leading the Washington bureaus of The Intercept and Huffington Post. At Huffington Post, he led a team that won a Pulitzer Prize and was twice finalist. He has chronicled the rise of progressives in Congress and is the author of The Squad, AOC, and the Hope of a Political Revolution. We've got people, and this is your country on drugs. And before we dive into what promises to be an engaging discussion, I want to thank our co-sponsors, Demand Progress and the Progressive Talent Pipeline. And Becca is there from the pipeline, Progressive Talent Pipeline. And I want to invite you, if you can check our website, CEPR.net. We publish reports. We publish a monthly report on sanctions that Pedro here writes. And we are monitoring every single day what's going on in the region. Because as I said, these are very difficult times, and we have to be aware of what they are doing, because they are doing many things. And we have to be informed in order to try those spaces of diplomacy that Greg talks about in this book that could help us prevent violence and war.
Thank you so much. Thank you, CEPR, Demand Progress, and thank you all for coming out here tonight. I will start by saying I really do encourage everybody to buy this book. It's terrific. You will not regret it. And I was looking forward to it when I heard it was coming out, and I was honored to be asked to do this, and it lived up to the hype. And so the first question I actually wanted to ask you is how long have you wanted to write this book? Is this your great white whale that you've been chasing? And can you talk a little bit about the sweep that you envisioned it encompassing?
Yeah, thanks, Ryan, and thanks for doing this. I was really excited. Is this on? No.
We'll put it right.
Okay. Oh, was I supposed to? Hello? Okay. And thanks so much for agreeing to be the kind of interlocutor for this conversation. I really appreciate your work, and it's really an honor to share the stage with you. So it's great. I've been writing about Latin America for a long time. And
A little closer.
I've been writing on Latin America for a long time, trying to bridge a divide between academic scholarship and kind of more public-facing work that looks at U.S. intervention in the region, but trying to think about that intervention. Everybody knows the United States' intervention in Latin America is atrocious. And even people who defend U.S. power in the world tend to say, yeah, okay, Latin America, Chile 73, Guatemala 54. They admit that maybe, but I think there was more of a story there, the interrelationship between Latin America and the United States. And I mean, there's a number of it's a long book. It's not, the text isn't 736 pages. There's a lot of footnotes and there's a lot of index. It's really 600 pages, but it's an easy read, people tell me.
I can confirm that.
But there's a number of through lines, and one of them is the tension between the development in Latin America of what is social rights, basically, not just individual rights, but a much more broader gamut of what it means to be a citizenship that includes the state's obligation to provide health care and education and welfare and old age pensions and the right to unions. Latin America really is the originator of that. It's the roots of social democratic modernity. It can be found in Latin America. And I contrast that to this almost cult-like death drive attachment to individual rights that the United States has, that serves in many ways as the kind of keystone that binds all the various factions of the conservative movement together. The idea that individuals have freedom, and it's the state's responsibility to withdraw to the greatest extent from the realm of freedom. Of course, that's there's a colorized version of that, right? Some people have that right, that expanded area of freedom, and other people don't. But there's ideally this tension between individual rights and social rights has been a kind of idea that I've had for a long time. I wanted to trace it, and I wanted to trace it out. And to do so, I start with the conquest, the Spanish conquest in the 1500s. A century before British ships started arriving in Jamestown, and so the book is a kind of comparison between the British and Spanish colonial projects, and then the tension and conflict between Latin America and the United States. And in many ways, even though the conflict in Gaza, the genocide in Gaza really had just started as I was bringing the book to a close. In my mind, the book really does run from the conquest to the genocide. That's the arc of the book.
You start the book with a sort of mini biography or an intellectual history of De las Casas, who I had a thumbnail sketch of him and his role in the 16th century, but I had no idea his centrality in the public debate. And some of the debates felt as if they were contemporary, like they could be carried out on Twitter, like today. But they're carried out in these different tracks and in papal rooms and royal rooms. Talk a little bit about the real De las Casas.
Yeah, before I do that, I'll say so the book starts with the Spanish conquest. And it starts with the internal critique of the conquest within Catholicism, right? It was a kind of revolution within Catholicism that was as consequential as the concurrent Reformation that was happening at the same time. The Spaniards, of course, as we know, Columbus and the conquistadores and Cortez and Pizarro, landed in the Americas and carried out what demographers call the greatest human mortality event in world history, when you include the diseases that they brought within a century. Something like along the lines of 90% of the population, which might have been up to 100 million people, was gone, just wiped off the face. And the violence of the first couple of decades of Spanish colonialism was comparable to what we see in going on in, just to bring it up again, in the occupied territory of Gaza. I mean, but at the same time, there emerged within Catholicism, because Catholicism pretended to be a universal religion. It understood itself as the bearer of all the world's humanitas, all the world's humanity. It was the bearer of world history. And it had to explain, like all of a sudden, they had this new world. And Las Casas, who was a Dominican priest, became a Dominican priest. He was wrong. He thought there were more people in the New World than there was in the Old World, but he was wrong about that. But there were millions of people, and he insisted that this posed a moral challenge to Catholicism. It wasn't just the Las Casas. There was a whole cadre of emancipationist priests who took the kind of kernel of decency that was within Catholicism and took it to its logical extreme about treating all human beings as equals. Las Casas has a famous slogan, all human lineage is one, meaning and scholars take that as one of the first pronouncements of human equality. That all the slow creation of the ideal of equality, the slow creation of humanity, begins with Las Casas. And Las Casas was kind of, he's a fascinating character because he was so obsessive in, At first he arrived to make money. He arrived in Hispaniola, which is now divided by Haiti and Dominican Republic, with the idea of being, a landowner. His father sailed with Christopher Columbus, his uncle sailed with Christopher Columbus, and he became what was in effect a Spanish slave owner. And then he had a revelation. And don't want to go too deep into the weeds about the revelation, but he became one of the most outspoken advocacies of equality. and he put forward a very forceful denunciation of the idea that Native Americans were subhuman. You know, he insisted that they were equal to Europeans, that they lived in polities, that they had interiority, that they laughed when they were happy, that they cried when they were sad, that they could possess property, that they did possess property. All of the justifications for why the Catholic, you know, the traditionalists were saying that Spain had a right to enslave Native Americans, he refuted. He argued against forcefully. Him and a number of other Dominicans and Franciscans and legal theorists. And this is the beginning of what I cite as political modernity. But you know, very early on in the conquest is, you know, the conquest contained the terms of its own negation. They were political theorists who denounced the claim that Spain had no right to title of the New World, that Native Americans were equal to Europeans, and that they had a right to their own dominion and sovereignty. There was a strong abolitionist tradition that emerged out of these debates. And why all of this is important is that this goes on for 100 years as the conquest is going on. And this is the main tension in the book between the barbarism of the conquest and the humanism that emerges in response to that. Now the British, just to jump ahead a little bit and anticipate a question that Ryan might have, the British, they're watching all of this. They're listening. You know, they're a fledgling nation. They're an aspiring empire, and they're paying attention to these debates. And I have a great quote in here. The Virginia Company in 1609, they called a meeting and they said, well, maybe we should issue a document or a pronunciation to justify what we hope to do in the Chesapeake and what we hope to do in Virginia and in New England. And then they have this long debate, and they just can't stop referencing these debates in Spain. Las Casas and Scopitoria, and they said, you know, the Spaniards have been debating this for over a century, and they can't justify empire, they can't justify slavery, they can't even justify war. So maybe it's better we don't say anything. They actually just go out and say that. Maybe it's better we don't say anything. And so they don't. And so that tension between the Spanish Empire, which is constantly trying to justify itself, in which they build an empire that understands itself as universal, but recognizes difference within that universalism, and a British Empire that denies the difference, that pushes everything out towards the frontier, that doesn't want to talk about them, that's sure of that, there's no dissent, no qualms about what, you know, enslaving Native Americans in North America by the time the British Empire. That tension is where I kind of locate the beginning of this fetish of individual rights in Anglo-America and the beginning, the intellectual origins of social rights in South America.
And when you were thinking about the structure of and the kind of borders of the book, what made you start at the Spanish conquest, and what would the book be like if you had gone into prehistory before the Spanish conquest and tried to get into some of that tension and that history that went in Central and South America and North America too?
Yeah. No, that's a great question, because this book is really focused on European thought and European arguments within a Spanish and British framework, and one could make the argument that there were subterranean influences of collective notions of solidarity that among Native Americans that influenced the way people thought. I think that that's true to some degree, and people have done work, certainly in the United States, on the influence of the Iroquois on political thought in Latin America, certainly in the hierarchical societies in Mesoamerica and the Andes. But really, what I wanted to focus on was the brutality in the Caribbean Hispaniola, and then the broader Caribbean, and then and then in the early years of the conquest, because this really was a kind of shock to European consciousness, right? Trying to make sense of what this all meant, and sparking this kind of moral revolution that leads to the beginning of a kind of political modernity.
And so then you have, an independence movement in North America.
Yeah.
And then you have multiple independence movements in South America that attempts to be, one movement. And what are the differences between those?
Yeah, that's a key question. So, just to get the chronology on the table, the United States Revolution is in the end of the 18th century. It's the first Republican Revolution. It's followed shortly thereafter by the French Revolution and the Haitian Revolution. And it's not really until the 1810s and the 1820s that the Spanish-American movements for independence, which compared to the United States are much more sprawling, much more descented. There's the Southern Cone, there's Colombia and Venezuela, there's Mexico, there's the Caribbean. There's, it's a much more kind of decentral movement where the 13 colonies, which 30 or 40 years earlier was tight and very clear. But aside from that, the main difference is, the United States comes into being in the world, and following this idea that a lot of Anglo thought and a lot of Anglo republicanism was predicated on not dealing with the question of race, and not just dealing with the question of dispossession. And the U.S. Revolution comes into the world. None of the founders of the U.S. Revolution questioned the righteousness of British settlement. There's no qualms, there's no doubts. John Adams said the country was discovered, it wasn't conquered. Later on, Woodrow Wilson said, there wasn't even a revolution at all. We really just methodized a series of principles regarding human liberty that came with the Puritans. There was this sense that there was certainly no moral qualms about what the revolution meant in terms of Native Americans. And the United States came into being a single nation on what its founders presumed to be an empty continent. Now, of course, it wasn't an empty continent. There was still France and Spain and soon to be Mexico and Native American sovereignties. But the founders of the United States, to a person, thought that the nation was going to get to the Pacific, hence the name, taking the name America to mean both a thin slice of land on the eastern side of the Appalachians or the Mississippi River, the United States, and the whole continent. And because they were sure that soon they would have the whole continent. And the U.S. Revolution, what the U.S. Revolution does it actually revives the doctrine of conquest and the legitimacy of the right of war. The U.S. justified taking Native American land and the right of conquest. It justified invading Texas, invading Mexico, and taking almost half of its national territory by the right of conquest, including California, and getting the U.S. taught the doctrine of conquest as a legal, valid principle up until the 1920s in the top law schools of the country. Latin America comes into being in the 1820s, already a United Nations, already a League of Nations, 7 independent nations plus Brazil, which was, it has a weird history. It was independent, but it was monarchist because the monarchy fled Portugal and Napoleon, but they declared themselves independent in Portugal. So you had 7 republics, and you had Brazil, and they immediately had to learn how to live with each other. They couldn't invoke the theory of sovereignty that the United States invoked. If they did, then it would be endless war. What would stop Argentina from saying, we want the Pacific too, and invading Chile? And people like Simón Bolívar, who plays a big role in the book, and others, really thought about what theory of sovereignty to justify themselves with. And they rejected the doctrine of conquest that the United States had revived, and they rejected a kind of realpolitik balance of power that Europe after Napoleon had put into place. Napoleon said that, Bolivar said that any theory of international relations that didn't have a transcendent vision of the good would always lead to war. Because we had just got a balance of power. If you had nations pushing against each other, pursuing their own interests, eventually that balance would topple and there'd be war. And so Bolivar and others came up with this idea that we're going to respect the boundaries of the colonial state as they were. We may not like them. They're arbitrary. They were drawn, Argentina, Chile, and Mexico. But we have to accept it as it is. They rehabilitate this old Roman law doctrine, te posseditis, meaning as you possess. But more importantly, they put forward a premise that the first principle of international relations is that states, new nation states, have shared interests, and cooperation should be the governing principle, not competition. And so nearly from the beginning in the 1820s, all of the principles that go into making the liberal international order, the rules-based order that up until Donald Trump was president, supposedly governed international relations. It didn't really, but at least it was there as an ideal. Was present at the founding of Latin American nations. Latin Americans literally were the first League of Nations. They came into being as a community of amity nations that learned how to cooperate with each other. Now, the reality on the ground, there's tension between the reality and ideal, just as a tension between the brutality of the conquest and the emergence of the notion of equality. There were wars between Brazil and Argentina and Paraguay, between Chile and Peru and Bolivia, but all of them was settled by affirming the doctrine of ute posseditis, the idea that these boundaries were involved. So there was a respect for sovereignty. Now the second important thing is that these independent leaders had at hand already a critique of conquest that they inherited from the theorists that had applied it to Spain. And so as the United States started moving west like a whirligig towards the Pacific, taking Florida, taking Mexico, taking California, annexing Texas, threatening to take Nicaragua, they had at hand a kind of intellectual apparatus to apply to what the United States was doing. So this tension between the United States as a conquering nation, an enslaving nation also, because in Latin America, even though slavery ended at different times, in different countries in Latin America, there was still a sense that independence entailed emancipation of slavery in all of its many kinds. So this kind of tension between the United States and Latin America emerges in this distinction of what the New World means and what even the name America means.
And what was the relationship between the United States and these revolutionaries? Can you talk a little bit about who within the United States was supportive, which politicians were supportive, which Mexican revolution, or not Mexican, but like which South American revolutionaries came to the U.S. And how did that debate unfold inside the United States, and then I guess lead into the Monroe doctrine?
So a lot of Latin American revolutionaries set up in Philadelphia. They set up printing presses in Philadelphia, and they printed tracts and translated political theory into Spanish, and then distributed them at used ships that leave out Port of Baltimore, and distributed them in Venezuela and in other sites of revolutionary activity. So there was a lot of interaction on that level, and there was a sense among the rank and file of the United States, second generation young people who kind of heard stories of the U.S. Revolution, but they missed out, right? Their fathers fought the U.S. Revolution. Looking at Latin America was a way of kind of reviving and kind of generating kind of these new revolutionary sensations and sentiments, right? So there was there was a number of U.S. actors went down and fought on the side of Latin American revolutionaries. So there was good feeling on a certain level that the hemisphere was becoming Republican. It was becoming anti-monarchical. It was becoming modern. On the level of governance, there was more hesitation. Basically, James Monroe was the president when independence really starts to take hold, and it's clear that it's irreversible. And Jefferson's still alive, and Adams is still alive, but they're older. Calhoun, some people like James Calhoun has come on the stage. Henry Clay, John Quincy Adams. They're influencing U.S. foreign policy. They don't really know how to act. Some of them want to wait. They don't give any formal recognition, which annoys the hell out of Bolivar, right? he thinks that the United States is very instrumental in its strategy. So they hold off the last minute, and what they issue is eventually they issue the famous Monroe Doctrine in 1823. Now the Monroe Doctrine is one of these things, like most countries have laws or decrees, only the United States has a doctrine. So it wasn't really called a doctrine at the time. It was really just about 4 or 5 paragraphs in Monroe's State of the Union address in 1823. And
this is a key detail, separated by
Yeah.
15 minutes of talk about post offices.
It wasn't even 5 paragraphs, 5 non-contiguous paragraphs. and basically, one of the
like you forgot part of it.
well, it was just and these speeches weren't delivered. They weren't delivered verbally. They were delivered like, here, read this. And so the Monroe Doctrine. It's interesting because one paragraph makes it clear that the United States announces that no part of the Americas that has achieved effective independence can be recolonized by Europe. And that's the part of the doctrine that Latin Americans read that, and they read it through the filter of their own antecedent ute possiditas, their own antecedent rejection of the doctrine of conquest. They thought the United States was affirming what they thought was a new Republican law, that repudiating the doctrine of conquest. Elsewhere in the 5 non-contiguous paragraphs was also the notice that the United States would take any event that happened anywhere in the hemisphere that they deemed affected itself as justification for it to act, and that's the part that becomes more pronounced as the century moves on. Where the Monroe Doctrine becomes kind of a standing warrant for mandatory power for the United States to act, or it becomes a kind of doctrine of informal empire, that the United States' responsibility in the Americas, the United States as the preeminent power in the hemisphere, it has the responsibility to police the hemisphere. But the Monroe Doctrine has this kind of tension between the two that makes it very difficult to define. Woodrow Wilson said that no matter how many times he's read it, he can't define exactly what it means. For a longest time, there were Latin American liberals who kept on hoping the anti-colonial premise of that part of the Monroe Doctrine would take prominence, right? And they up throughout the 19th century. But of course, that's not what happened. What happened was that as the United States invaded Mexico, invaded Nicaragua, threatened Cuba, the Monroe Doctrine as a kind of doctrine of mandatory power over an informal empire became kind of associated with U.S. nationalism and associated with a certain kind of U.S. Isolationism. Not so much isolationism, but a certain kind of when Pete Heskett, recently said that America first, but for America first, the Americas have to come first. So there's never really been an isolationist movement in the United States. Isolationism always included power and dominance over Latin America, but that's another story. We'll come back to that.
One quick timeout. My girls are in the back there. Hey, did you guys order? Are you eating? Okay, thank you.
Ryan has twins, right?
A little bit of a detour, but as we get closer to the League of Nations, I did want to stop on this fascinating section about Lincoln, and it's rather shameful. And Frederick Douglass, called him out in classic Frederick Douglass prose. Shameful effort to what he called colonization, which was basically trying to deport the freedmen.
Yeah.
Talk a little bit about that tendency and how that.
Well, there were many different schemes. People were aware that the problem of slavery had to be solved, right? Even some slavers realized the problem of slavery had to be solved. That it was a threat to the Republic, it was a threat to the Union, and many different schemes were advanced. James Monroe created Liberia as a way to return free people of color to Africa, which was largely a failure. Lincoln went back and forth on this question. And as he went back and forth on whether he was fighting to save the Union or fighting to end slavery, all of these historical actors acting in incredibly complex power relations very rarely have a coherent moral sense of right and wrong. Usually there's a lot of contradictory ideas, and Lincoln for a while thought that promoting colonization, he did think Liberia was too far away, so he started promoting the idea of Central America, creating colonies in Panama, and this also was connected with the idea of building a railroad across Panama to get from the Atlantic to the Pacific. So yes, the book has a discussion. There's a section in which a delegation of leaders of free people come to visit Lincoln to protest these colonization plans, and Lincoln, basically continues to push them, and he and the people around him thought that maybe the removal of free people of color would be one solution to the problem that emancipation would cause.
And then other people start pushing out and say, actually, we're going to have a massive labor shortage.
Yeah. A couple of people in his cabinet thought that. Yes, and to be fair, a couple of people in his cabinet actually were against it for moral reasons. They thought that this was they sounded like De Las Casas. This was an invasion of our moral responsibility to create a free world. When Reconstruction failed, Ulysses S. Grant hoped to buy the Dominican Republic as a colony of African Americans. And when you read it sounds horrible, and it is, of course, the idea that you're going to buy the Dominican Republic and you're just going to send African Americans there. But when you actually read what he says, there's a real kind of sorrow that Reconstruction has failed. That he found it impossible for the federal government to stop racial terror in the South. And he talks about the Dominican Republic as a place where African Americans can at least be masters of their own, be masters of themselves without having to worry about the night riders. And there is a sense that that we can't do this. And Reconstruction fails almost kind of correspondingly with the drive west, right? There's a renewed push west to finish the wars on Native Americans and the dispossession of Native Americans in the West and settle the frontier.
I also found your sketch of Wilson and his relationship with Mexico to be quite fascinating. And to start with, when it comes to the assassination that sparks, that leads to the revolution, what do historians say, and do you suspect that Taft, that the ambassador there was acting alone, or do you suspect that this was policy? Because it also reminded me of the assassination of Lumumba,
Yeah.
which came after Eisenhower loses the presidential election, and Kennedy is on his way in, and Kennedy is understood to be much more favorable to Lumumba.
Yeah.
And they kill him before Kennedy is sworn in.
Yeah.
Identical situation.
That's interesting. I didn't make that analogy. That's a great analogy. That's exactly what happens. I mean, for the uninitiated, the Mexican Revolution breaks out in 1910, and it's an enormous historical event. It's the first real third world revolution. I mean, there's the Haitian Revolution, which is against sugar plantation economy, but the Mexican Revolution really is the first third world revolution against industrial property relations. And there's a massive amount of U.S. property that's confiscated, mines and land. And Mexico, after the Civil War, had become the United States' first nation-building project. Capital from New York and Boston and Philadelphia flooded into Mexico and basically took over every profitable sector that you can imagine: mining and agriculture and electricity and ports and roads and railroads. And the Mexican Revolution was this enormous nationalist revolution against U.S. capital and its enabling justifications. And that's in 1910. And it's at first led by a fairly moderate, very wealthy man from the north, because a lot of the northern Mexican industrialists were, were tired about being aced out by U.S. capital, and they wanted their nation back, and they wanted to make their own money. And it was led by Francisco Madero, and he was, just to make, we don't have that much time, but he was assassinated in 1913. Just as Wilson was coming into power, coming into the presidency, and that kicks off the violent, tumultuous stage of the Mexican Revolution. Different factions, Zapata and Villa and Carranza, which goes on for decades and decades until you get to Cardenas in the 1930s. But yes, it seems fairly clear that Taft's ambassador, who was also named Wilson, Henry Lane Wilson, no relation to Woodrow Wilson, was very much involved in plotting against Francisco Madero, because he even though he wasn't a radical, he had this smell of reform about him, and U.S. investors in Mexico didn't want anybody telling them, presuming that property should be regulated or registered or taxed at a slightly greater rate. And Madero was executed by an ally of the United States, Huerta, and the contrast with Lumumba is very interesting, because it's true. Wilson's election, Maduro was executed between Wilson's election and his inauguration, but the election of Wilson in the United States made many people think that, well, he has two very literate, reforming liberals in power in Mexico and the United States, and there was a chance for kind of reform on both sides of the border. And the execution of Madero was really a kind of a key moment, and it was a shock to Wilson himself. So I spent a lot of time about Wilson's grappling with what the Mexican Revolution meant to him. Wilson is we all know nobody likes Wilson. We all he's a racist. He segregated. He resegregated the civil servants. He drove the United States into World War I unnecessarily. He occupied Haiti and the Dominican Republic, and he did all sorts of horrible things. But the Mexican Revolution kind of changed him, and for a while understood himself as on the side of the revolutionaries. He refused to recognize Huerta after the assassination of Maduro, even though all of the capitalists in the Democratic Party, particularly in Texas and in California, wanted immediate recognition of Huerta. He refused. He thought Huerta was came to power through illegitimate means, and he wasn't going to recognize him. But that didn't leave him many choices, and he wound up, he basically wound up supplying Zapata, Villa, and Carranza with weapons. So he's basically sided with the Mexican revolutionaries, and
he even changed the law, you're right, at one point, so that they could legally, like first he was secretly arming them, pretending he was sending arms to China or something.
Yeah, and even his occupation of Veracruz was meant to support Carranza, but ultimately he couldn't deal with what sovereignty meant in its fullest form. And at the same time, he saw all of Latin America, and this, I don't know if we have much time to go into this, but Pan-Americanism becomes kind of a model for Wilson of what he wants to do with the League of Nations. And this is another through line of the book, is the way that, when I talked about how Latin America was the first League of Nations, it was the first United Nations, Latin American nations start having meetings, they start having conferences, one conference after another, and here, in Lima, in Quito, in Santiago, in Bogota, conference after conference after conference. Sometimes the United States participated, sometimes the United States didn't participate, but by the time you get to Wilson, you have in place a kind of Pan-American Union that began the integration of the Americas in terms of postal roads and weights and measures and shipping and health initiatives and things like that, the Pan-American Union. And Wilson really sees this as the model for what could be put into place after World War I in Versailles. The reform in Wilson, right? Wilson's first vision of the League of Nations is the vision that the socialists and the anti-colonialists liked. They thought that it was going to limit the power of Europe's empires and bring about self-determination. And this is the Wilson that revives that part of the Monroe Doctrine that the Latin Americans liked. And they kept on saying, well, what do you want to do? What's your vision for the League of Nations? And he said, if you want to know what the League of Nations is, look at the Monroe Doctrine. It means the sovereign equality of all nations. It means an end to aggressive war. It means cooperation. It means the spirit of the Monroe Doctrine, but on a world level. Now, of course, that's not what the League of Nations winds up being. The League of Nations, after the war, Wilson gets boxed in by Great Britain, he gets boxed in by France, who want to keep their empires, they want to keep their mandatory power, the mandatory territories in the Middle East. And at home, nationalists, they don't want to universalize the Monroe Doctrine. They start talking about the Monroe Doctrine much the way originalists talk about the Constitution, as something God-given, written in stone, that the United States has the right to run Latin America at will. That's their interpretation of the Monroe Doctrine, the isolationists and the conservatives who don't like the League of Nations at all. So by the time you get to the final draft of what the League of Nations is, there's an affirmation of the Monroe Doctrine, but it's the Monroe Doctrine in its imperialist form. And it's funny because reading the debate going into it, Wilson comes back to the United States. He realizes that so much of the argument here in the United States has been over the meaning of the Monroe Doctrine. He has a meeting with Howard Taft. Taft says, you've got to affirm the Monroe Doctrine in its original meaning we have our power over Latin America, and nothing that you sign in Paris is going to impinge on that. So Wilson goes back for the final drafting session, and he says we have to have this Article 17. It affirms that nothing in this document will affect the Monroe Doctrine. So then all of a sudden everybody starts asking him, well, what do you mean by that? And he can't answer it. He won't answer. And then France says, well, can we put a footnote in the French delegate, can we put a footnote in? And Japan is fine with this because Japan is thinking that, well, is looking at China and thinking that they can have a Monroe Doctrine for Asia. China is at these drafting sessions and it's nervous because it knows what Japan is thinking. Great Britain is fine with it because they want a Monroe Doctrine for Africa. And so you see this very quicksilver nature of the Monroe Doctrine, where Wilson, for a very brief moment, rehabilitates the anti-colonial essence of the Monroe Doctrine in order to sell an idealist vision of what a true League of Nations that does away with empires and recognizes sovereignty and whatnot. But then by the time he's boxed in and defeated, he's basically, he's got the Spanish flu, he's sick, he won't answer any questions. This every other resolution passes unanimously by consent. 5 countries objected to this, including the Monroe Doctrine, and Wilson just said, "That's it, it passed." And then that was it. It was over. Collapses.
Right, he's delirious and
yeah, he's delirious.
And dies not long after.
Yeah, exactly.
And he has a stroke, which I heard connected to the Spanish flu. That, as we've learned through COVID, that deep sickness like that can often then lead to a stroke.
Yeah, and then
not long after.
Yeah,
right. Where does Latin come from?
That's a great question. So this is actually backtracking a little bit. The second generation of Latin American reformers who began to really work a critique of U.S. interventionism, right? They saw the United States growing stronger, the beginnings of gunboat diplomacy, U.S. gunboats coming down the Atlantic, down around the Cape, and up into Chile, enforcing debt, imposing commercial treaties on countries, threatening to take Cuba, taking Texas, and taking Mexico. And in 1855, William Walker, a mercenary from Tennessee who was allied with Confederate slavers, invades Nicaragua, declares himself president, and reinstitutes slavery, an institution that Nicaragua had abolished 30 years earlier. And this, of course, galvanizes the region's second generation reformers. One of them was a Chilean named Francisco Bilbao, and he just leads the ideological charge against Walker. Walker eventually falls. Franklin Pierce, the president of the United States, immediately recognizes Walker's government as legitimate. All the southern soon-to-be Confederate states, support Walker and are sending colonists down with their slaves. Basically, a lot of people are thinking that Nicaragua is just going to be Texas all over again. And eventually, though, he's driven out. The rest of Central America, the military gets Costa Rica and Honduras to get together, and they basically drive Walker out and assassinate him execute him on a Honduran beach. But it's around this time that a lot of these Latin American reformers are going to Paris. They're very much influenced by the rehabilitation of the French Revolution. After, there's the French Revolution, there's the Terror, there's Napoleon, there's the reaction. But then in the 1830s and 1840s, there's a kind of rehabilitation leading to, of course, 1848, the great revolutions in Europe. And a lot of Latin American reformers and intellectuals are very much influenced by Parisian thought and by the idea that, this was a time where peoples were kind of organizing themselves around these ineffable categories. The Saxons already thought they were Saxons, right? Since Thomas Jefferson, they had this whole ideology of Saxonness, coming out of the German forests. But Latin, the idea of Latin as somehow conjugating all of the different remnants of what was the Holy Roman Empire and the Spanish Catholic Empire and the Portuguese Empire, but it immediately became less about Catholicism and less about the language. speaking Spanish, and less about history and more about the opposition to the United States. So Latin became part of, opposed to Saxon America. So where Saxon America was greedy and grubbing and grasping and capitalist and instrumental, Latin America was diaphanous and humanist and spiritual and more universal. It was more emancipationist, it was abolitionist. And so there was this notion that Latin America opposed to Saxon America, these two Americas. And this is where there was a poem, The Other America, Two Americas. Jose Marti later would talk about Our America. So it was, and it wasn't just a kind of, it wasn't just an intellectual conceit. I mean, today, Los Tigres del Norte, the Norteño band, Corrido, they have a song, Somos Más Americanos, and that, they're unbelievably popular among migrant workers, the ones that are being targeted by Trump. So there is this kind of notion that Latin represents something more humanistic. And so, for instance, there was in the 1890s, in a Pan American conference that Jose Marti attended, the United States was trying to get Latin America to agree to a tariff union, and they talked about America for America, and then the Argentine delegate said, no, America for humanity. And this is, it's an important, it's easy to mock that because obviously, all you have to do is look at Salvador and Bukele and know that there are deep reactionary tendencies, currents that are not diaphanous and humanist and universal, that are brutal and the death squads of the Cold War, for instance, and finish it. But it is true that there is something about Latin American nationalism, and this is something that I try to get at in the book. Think about the I know we're probably getting near the end, so I'll just jump ahead a little bit. Think about the reaction to the failure of neoliberalism and global market economics that Clinton put into place with the WTO and all NAFTA and all of that stuff, right? And you think about the nationalist reaction, whether it be in Turkey or the Philippines or Russia or in the United States, it's a kind of belligerent nationalism that emerges in reaction to the globalists. It's not really true in Latin America. Latin America still holds on to a notion in which the nation is the stepping stone to the universal. In the book I compared Latin America to Germany. Germany's relationship to Great Britain prior to World War II, prior to the rise of the Nazis, was not unlike that of Latin America's relationship to the United States. Germany felt like it was put that Great Britain, was dominating world politics, that it understood itself as, the top of the civilizational chain. There was all sorts of romantic critiques that came out of Germany, that condemned Anglo-materialism and Anglo-capitalism, and we know where that led to. That led straight to Heidegger and the Nazis, right? Like that kind of romantic nationalism that posits some kind of soil and blood and can have a very dark side, right? A very particularist side. Latin America had all of those elements. It was humiliated by the United States. It understood capitalists as foreign capital as vampiric. It understood, it had that whole critique that I just talked about in terms of Latin America. But it never developed. But it never, there was certainly fascist currents within Latin America. But nothing. But the dominant current of nationalism was largely socialist and universalist, and to this day, I would say it's true. I mean, certainly there's we see the rise of nativism against migrants as a result of like the catastrophic policies that Washington has pursued over the last 20 years. But for the most part, to be Latin American nationalism still kind of is understood as as a stepping stone to universalism. And to the degree that ethnic groups, right, marginalized indigenous groups, enter national politics, they don't do so as the bearers of ethnic particularity. They do so as the bearers of their country's best tradition of social democracy. And so there's something about that, right, Latin America, you know, that the book tries to capture and get at, right? That there is this, that Latin America really is the last bastion. It's the last region in the world that takes the radical Enlightenment at its word.
Yeah, and on that point, I want to leave time for some questions. The last question from me, very much related to that. You write a lot about the 30s and 40s. Can you talk a little bit about the relationship between FDR and these Latin American anti-fascist forces? And I'm curious, and I know historians don't generally like to do this, but like, if the U.S. had continued to follow FDR's model of relations with Latin America, what does this hemisphere look like compared to what we decided to do instead? And was that even possible? Are the forces that drove it out of Wall Street and out of the law firms too powerful?
It's the thing about, there's no counterfactuals in history, so you can't say, right, if what an alternative would have been. But the book does go through all of this. Does go through how, you know, the 1930s was a kind of hemispheric New Deal, that Roosevelt's, that Latin America, in many ways, which I probably don't have time to go into, you have to buy the book, saved the New Deal. It saved the New Deal by creating markets for a more progressive, export-oriented class that was willing to let reform domestically move forward. Cordell Hull, Roosevelt's Secretary of State in 1933, under express orders by FDR not to do this, accepted recognized the absolute sovereignty of all nations in their foreign and domestic affairs and renounced the right to intervention. And he became this, unbelievable, an unconquering hero. There were headlines, the age of imperialism over. In Latin America, I've been trying to get the United States to give up the doctrine of conquest for a century and a half, and it hadn't, and it finally did it in 1933. And it was Cordell Hull, the Secretary of State, who did it in Montevideo at a Pan American conference, and that set up a decade of unparalleled goodwill. You know, I can't really go into the details, but you know, Latin America could have been Spain, right? I mean, Latin America had all the social variables, sociological variables that Spain had that led to the rise of a fascist, Praetorian, Catholic, patriarchal, militarist reaction against, you know, modern republicanism. And Spain, they won. The fascists won. In Latin America had all of those. It had strong, you know, small landed class threatened by an increasingly mobilized peasantry. It had, Praetorian values, patriarchal Catholic values. That, it could, and there was strong social base to fascism in Latin America. And it didn't go, and this was the worst nightmare of U.S. strategists, that all of Latin America, starting with Mexico, because a lot of people saw the Mexican Revolution through the prism of Spain. They thought Mexico, especially when Mexico had a number of counter-revolutions within its revolution, that if the United States lost Latin America to something like a continental Franco or a number of Francos, then the United States would be isolated, right? This would be a bridge from Germany, Portugal, Italy, Spain, and then Latin America. But it didn't, because FDR on an ad hoc basis and not always in a coherent way, tended to support economic nationalists, and certainly in Mexico, with Cardenas, allowing the Mexican Revolution and the most radical elements of the Mexican Revolution come forth in the 1930s. The same thing in Brazil. I mean, he supported Vargas, even though Vargas was a dictator. There's a great scene in which FDR wins I make a lot of this because he uses the good neighbor phrase, not just to talk about U.S.-Latin American relations, but it's the name of, it's his domestic get out the vote movement within the United States for his 1936 re-election. And within, he creates all of these good neighbor leagues and clubs, and they're specifically meant to counter the Liberty Leagues and the American Legions and the Saxon supremacy and anti-communism and reaction that those other leagues represented. The good neighbor leagues represented a kind of new worldview. It was a way of bringing in, you know, a tolerance for diversity abroad. Roosevelt said, "Your Americanism and mine," and tolerance for diversity at home. African Americans joined these leagues in the South and in Chicago and New York. You know, white ethnics in New York and Chicago, Chicanos in the Southwest, Native Americans. These good neighbor leagues were unbelievably popular. Roosevelt said he wanted them to patent the name. And Roosevelt won in 1936 with 27 million votes. He won more votes than any human being ever won in history. And he won it on a social democratic program pushing back against a right-wing reaction. And the first thing that he does after he wins is he goes to Latin America. He goes to Brazil and he goes to Buenos Aires. And he begins to help organize the continent for the anti-fascist struggle to come. And I talked all about that just to get to this little incident with, he's in a car with Vargas, who's the president of Brazil, and they're going up into the center of Rio, and there's a protest, and Vargas says, "They call me a dictator," and Roosevelt says, "Me too." You know, and so Roosevelt was elected, Vargas wasn't elected, but they both claimed to be, were both the fathers of the New Deal, right? So there wasn't an obsession about elections. It was more concerned about social reform, and being able to count Latin America in the anti-fascist fight was absolutely key. And what becomes anti-fascism, and this is what, you know, this is one lesson for the president, is, you know, Latin Americans didn't think that the fight against fascism was just about beating fascism. They thought it was about building social democracy, right? They thought that the world that was going to come into being after what would be a social democratic world. And to get back to Ryan's question, that's not what happened. and the way I kind of deal with it is through Henry Wallace and Henry Wallace's popularity in Latin America. Henry Wallace is, of course, FDR's vice president during his third term, and he's aced out by Truman when Roosevelt runs in '44. But Wallace does a tour of Latin America in 1943, that in the book I argue that this is really the beginning of the Democratic Party, the conservatives in the Democratic Party, and Wall Street realizing that Wallace can't be president. He's touring, he's speaking to communist unions, he's telling them that they're the front line of democracy. He's saying that when the war against fascism on the battlefield ends, the real war against fascism begins. And the only way that we win that war is by raising the wages of all. Latin Americans didn't think that Roosevelt was going to run in '44. They thought they were talking to the next president of the United States. They were calling him Mr. President, Henry Wallace. This freaked out the power brokers within the Democratic Party that basically let Roosevelt run again, but only if he. So that doesn't really it answers your question with an addict.
Yeah.
I don't know.
So if Anjali can bring a mic around the center if they have it. And while somebody's making a question, I'll just add one nugget to that. One of the most heartbreaking things, anecdotes you had, was about how the key to the Latin American contribution was sending wheat and other, food stuffs over to the Allies to, keep them going on credit, and then they're paid with discounted weapons afterwards, which then has its own obvious knock-on consequences at home. It sucks.